The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Pinewood Estates, one of the most exclusive gated communities in suburban Atlanta. Every house stood like a monument to wealth and status, with their marble columns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and luxury cars parked in circular driveways. The community prided itself on maintaining what the residents called standards, a carefully crafted environment where everything looked pristine and everyone knew their place. At 6:30 a.m., a modest Honda Civic pulled through the ornate iron gates, its driver showing her cleaning service identification to the security guard. The woman behind the wheel was in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a plain blue uniform with Premier Cleaning Services embroidered on the pocket. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, another hard-working housekeeper arriving for her morning shift. What none of them knew was that Diana Washington had spent the last 22 years as one of the FBI's most decorated agents. She had infiltrated organized crime families, taken down international drug cartels, and solved cases that had stumped law enforcement for decades. Her undercover work had earned her commendations from 3 different FBI directors, and her colleagues knew her as someone who could disappear into any role completely. But 6 months ago, Diana had made a choice that surprised everyone who knew her. After 2 decades of chasing the most dangerous criminals in America, she had requested early retirement to care for her aging mother. The decision hadn't been easy, but when her mother's Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she needed constant care, Diana knew what she had to do. However, retirement hadn't suited her as well as she'd hoped. The quiet days felt empty after years of high-stakes investigations, and the medical bills for her mother's care were mounting faster than her pension could cover. When a friend mentioned that Premier Cleaning Services was looking for reliable workers and paid well for clients in upscale neighborhoods, Diana had decided to give it a try. She told herself it was temporary, just until she could get her mother's care situation stabilized, and maybe find work as a private security consultant. She'd worked undercover for so many years that taking on another role felt natural. Besides, there was something appealing about honest, straightforward work after decades of deception and danger. Diana parked outside the Hendersons' massive Tudor-style home and gathered her cleaning supplies from the trunk. The Hendersons were a nice enough couple. He was a surgeon, she was a real estate lawyer, and they treated Diana with respect. They paid well, always left clear instructions, and never made her feel like she was invisible the way some wealthy clients did. As she approached the front door, Diana noticed a white van parked across the street that hadn't been there during her previous visits. 2 men in official-looking uniforms sat inside, watching the neighborhood with the kind of attention that immediately triggered Diana's professional instincts. Something about their posture and the way they were surveying the area didn't sit right with her. Diana had learned long ago to trust her instincts. In her FBI career, that sixth sense had kept her alive more times than she could count. These men weren't typical HOA officials making their rounds. Their body language was too aggressive, their attention too focused. She made a mental note to keep an eye on them while she worked. Mrs. Henderson answered the door with her usual warm smile. "Good morning, Diana. I've left the list on the kitchen counter, as usual. We'll be out most of the day. I have depositions until late afternoon." "No problem, Mrs. Henderson. I'll have everything spotless by the time you get back." Diana had developed a routine over the past month of working in Pinewood Estates. She started with the main living areas, worked her way through the bedrooms, and finished with the kitchen. The work was physically demanding, but oddly satisfying. There was something peaceful about creating order, about making things clean and beautiful. As she worked, Diana found herself thinking about her mother. The nursing facility where she now lived was expensive but excellent, and Diana knew she was getting the best possible care. Still, the guilt of not being able to care for her mother personally weighed heavily. Every dollar Diana earned brought them closer to financial stability, but it also meant time away from the woman who had sacrificed so much to raise her. Around 10 o'clock, Diana was vacuuming the living room when she heard raised voices outside. Through the large bay window, she could see the 2 men from the van confronting an elderly black man who was walking a small dog. The man appeared to be explaining something, but the uniformed men seemed to be getting more agitated rather than less. Diana turned off the vacuum and moved closer to the window. Her training kicked in automatically as she began to assess the situation. The elderly man was clearly a resident. He had keys in his hand and was pointing toward one of the houses. His body language showed confusion and mild distress, not the aggressive posture of someone who didn't belong. The two men, however, were displaying classic intimidation tactics. They had positioned themselves to block the man's path, were standing too close to his personal space, and their hand gestures were becoming more threatening. Diana could see that one of them had what appeared to be handcuffs hanging from his belt. Something was very wrong with this picture. Diana had encountered fake law enforcement before in her FBI career. Sometimes they were criminals trying to gain access to homes or neighborhoods. Other times they were vigilantes who had appointed themselves as unofficial authority figures. Either way, they were dangerous because they operated outside the system with no real accountability. She watched as the confrontation escalated. One of the fake officers grabbed the elderly man's arm, causing him to drop his dog's leash. The small terrier began barking frantically, adding to the chaos of the scene. The man was trying to explain something, but the fake officers weren't interested in listening. Diana made a decision. She couldn't stand by and watch what appeared to be harassment or worse. Her days of avoiding confrontation to maintain her cover were over. She was no longer an active agent, and she had a moral obligation to help someone in trouble. She quickly pulled out her phone and began recording, making sure to capture the faces of the fake officers and the license plate of their van. Then, she called 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Diana Washington at 1247, Maple Grove and Pinewood Estates. I'm witnessing what appears to be an assault by two men claiming to be HOA officers. They're physically restraining an elderly resident. Are you in immediate danger, ma'am? Not at this moment. But the situation is escalating quickly. The victim appears to be in distress. Officers are en route. Please stay on the line and keep yourself safe. Diana continued watching from the window while staying on the phone with the dispatcher. The fake officers had now forced the elderly man to sit on the curb while they stood over him in a clearly threatening manner. One of them was on his radio, though Diana doubted he was actually communicating with any legitimate authority. She could see other residents beginning to notice the commotion. A few people had come out of their houses and were watching from their yards, but no one was intervening. This bothered Diana more than she wanted to admit. The bystander effect was something she'd studied in her training, but seeing it play out in real time when someone needed help was deeply frustrating. The elderly man looked tired and scared. His small dog had returned to his side and was pressed against his leg, still whimpering. Diana could see him trying to explain something again, but the fake officers were having none of it. Ma'am, are you still there? The dispatcher asked. Yes, I'm here. The situation hasn't improved. The victim still appears to be in distress. Real police officers should be arriving within the next few minutes. Please continue to observe and report anything that changes. Diana watched as one of the fake officers began to pace back and forth in front of the elderly man, clearly agitated about something. She could see him gesturing angrily, though she couldn't make out the words from inside the house. Whatever was being said was making the situation worse. Then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The second fake officer was now holding what appeared to be zip-tie restraints, the kind sometimes used as temporary handcuffs. He was showing them to the elderly man in what was clearly a threatening gesture. Diana had seen enough. Emergency response or not, she wasn't going to stand by while someone was terrorized in broad daylight. Her FBI training had taught her to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately, and this situation was rapidly moving beyond verbal intimidation. She hung up with 911 after updating them on the escalation and headed for the front door. As she stepped outside, she could hear the fake officers more clearly. You people need to learn your place in this neighborhood, one of them was saying. We don't care what your lease says or who you think you are. This is a respectable community. Sir, please, the elderly man was saying. I've lived here for 8 years. I was just walking my dog like I do every morning. I don't understand what I've done wrong. Walking around like you own the place, the other fake officer responded. Letting your dog run loose, disturbing the peace. We have standards here. Diana could see that the dog had never been running loose. It had only gotten away when they'd grabbed its owner. The whole situation was clearly based on nothing more than prejudice and intimidation. As she walked across the street, Diana could feel her training taking over. Her posture straightened, her awareness heightened, and her mind began cataloging details that could be important later. The fake officers' uniforms looked official at first glance, but up close she could see they were poorly made. Their badges were the wrong shape for any legitimate law enforcement agency she knew of. "Excuse me," Diana called out in a clear, authoritative voice. "Is there a problem here?" Both fake officers turned to look at her, and Diana could immediately see the dismissive expressions cross their faces. To them, she was just another housekeeper, someone with no authority or importance. That assumption was about to become a very costly mistake. "Nothing that concerns you, lady," the first fake officer said. "Go back to your cleaning and mind your own business." "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help but notice the commotion," Diana replied calmly. "I was wondering if you could show me your credentials. I'd like to understand what authority you have to detain residents." The second fake officer laughed harshly. "Authority? We're HOA enforcement. We don't need to show anything to the hired help." Diana felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when confronting dangerous suspects. Her voice remained steady and professional. "Actually, sir, even HOA officials operating within their authority should be able to provide proper identification when requested. It's a matter of community safety. Lady, you need to walk away right now," the first fake officer said, his tone becoming more threatening. "This doesn't involve you, and you don't want to make it involve you." The elderly man looked up at Diana with a mixture of hope and concern. "Ma'am, you don't need to get involved. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." Diana knelt down beside him, speaking in a gentle but clear voice. "Sir, what's your name?" "Robert Chun. I live at 1289 Oak Hill Drive." "Mr. Chun, have these men identified themselves properly to you?" "They said they were from the HOA, but I've never seen them before. I've lived here 8 years, and I know all the board members." "These aren't them." Diana stood up and faced the fake officers again. "Gentlemen, Mr. Chun raises a valid point. Could you please provide proper identification and explain exactly what violation you believe has occurred?" The first fake officer stepped closer to Diana, clearly trying to use his size to intimidate her. "Listen here, cleaning lady. You're about to find yourself in a world of trouble if you don't walk away right now." Diana didn't move. Years of facing down armed criminals had made her immune to this kind of basic intimidation. "Sir, I'm simply asking you to follow proper procedures. If you're legitimate HOA officials, that shouldn't be a problem." "That's it," the second fake officer said. "You want to stick your nose where it doesn't belong? Fine. You can sit down right here with your friend." He reached for Diana's arm, which was exactly the mistake she'd been waiting for him to make. In one fluid motion that was too fast for either fake officer to track, Diana sidestepped the grab, caught the man's wrist, and twisted it into a control hold that immediately brought him to his knees. The move was textbook FBI defensive tactics, executed with the precision of someone who had done it hundreds of times. "Sir," Diana said calmly, maintaining the hold while the fake officer winced in pain, "you just committed assault and battery. I suggest you reconsider your approach." The first fake officer stared in shock for a moment before reaching for what Diana now realized was a stun gun on his belt. "Let him go right now, or you're going to regret it." "I don't think so," Diana replied. Her voice still perfectly. The Atlanta Police Department patrol car pulled up just as Diana was considering whether she needed to escalate her control of the second fake officer. 3 more police vehicles arrived within the next 2 minutes, their blue and red lights painting the pristine neighborhood in an official glow that most Pinewood Estates residents had never seen before. Officer Maria Santos stepped out of the first car, her hand resting casually but purposefully on her service weapon as she assessed the scene. She was a 10-year veteran with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. What she saw was unusual, to say the least. A woman in a cleaning uniform expertly restraining a man in what appeared to be an official uniform, while an elderly man sat nearby with a small dog. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to slowly release that gentleman and step back," Officer Santos called out, her voice professional but firm. Diana looked up and smiled. "Absolutely, officer. But I should mention that these gentlemen may not be who they appear to be. She smoothly released the fake officer's wrist and stepped back with her hands visible, her movements calm and controlled in a way that immediately told Santos this wasn't Diana's first interaction with law enforcement. The fake officer scrambled to his feet, rubbing his wrist and looking both furious and embarrassed. "Thank God you're here. This woman assaulted me. She came out of nowhere and attacked me while I was conducting official HOA business." Officer Santos looked between Diana and the fake officers, her trained eye picking up details that didn't quite fit. "Let's start with everyone showing me some identification. All of you." Diana reached slowly into her pocket and produced her driver's license, along with something else that made Santos do a double take, a retired FBI agent credentials wallet. "Diana Washington, retired Federal Bureau of Investigation. I called 911 to report what I believe to be assault and impersonation of officials." The fake officers exchanged worried glances. This was clearly not how they'd expected their morning to go. "FBI?" Santos asked, her eyebrows rising. "Ma'am, are you saying you're a federal agent?" "Retired as of 6 months ago," Diana clarified. 22 years in the Bureau. Mostly organized crime and undercover work." Santos turned to the fake officers. "And you gentlemen are?" The first fake officer, his name tag read Johnson, pulled out a wallet and produced an official-looking ID card. "Brad Johnson, HOA compliance officer for Pinewood Estates." This woman interfered with legitimate enforcement action. Santos examined the ID carefully. She'd been a cop long enough to spot fake credentials, and something about this one didn't feel right. The cardstock was wrong, the printing was slightly off, and the photograph looked like it had been added recently. "And you, sir?" she asked the second fake officer. "Mike Foster, also HOA compliance." He produced a similar ID, though his was even more obviously fake to Santos's trained eye. Officer Santos looked over at Mr. Chun, who was still sitting on the curb holding his dog. "Sir, what's your version of what happened here?" Robert Chun stood up slowly, his age and the stress of the morning evident in his movements. "Officer, I was just walking Buddy like I do every morning. These men approached me and said I was violating neighborhood rules. When I tried to explain that I live here, they became aggressive. They grabbed my arm and forced me to sit down. That's when this lady came over to help." "How long have you lived in this neighborhood, Mr. Chun?" 8 years next month. I'm retired from Georgia Tech. I was a professor in the engineering department. I know all the real HOA board members, and I've never seen these men before." Santos was beginning to form a clearer picture of what had happened. She'd dealt with fake officials before, usually wannabe security guards or vigilantes who appointed themselves as neighborhood enforcers. But this case had some unusual elements, particularly the professional way the cleaning lady had handled the situation. "Ms. Washington," Santos said, "you mentioned you believe these men were impersonating officials. What led you to that conclusion?" Diana's response was measured and professional. "Several factors, officer. First, their uniforms are poor quality reproductions. The stitching is wrong. The badges are the wrong shape for any legitimate law enforcement agency I'm familiar with. Second, their behavior was consistent with intimidation tactics rather than proper procedure. They made no attempt to de-escalate, showed no interest in hearing Mr. Chen's explanation, and became physically aggressive when questioned." "She's making all this up," Johnson protested. "We were doing our jobs. This neighborhood has standards, and people need to follow them." "What specific standards were being violated?" Santos asked. Foster stepped forward aggressively. "Look, we don't have time for this. We have authority in this neighborhood, and this woman interfered with official business. We want her arrested for assault." Santos looked at Diana. "Ma'am, did you put your hands on these gentlemen?" "I used minimal force defensive tactics when Mr. Foster attempted to grab me," Diana replied calmly. "I was trained in these techniques during my time with the Bureau. I used only the amount of force necessary to prevent what I believe to be an unlawful detention." Officer Santos was impressed by Diana's precise language and calm demeanor. In her experience, people who were lying or trying to hide something rarely spoke with such measured accuracy. Another police car arrived, and Detective James Wright stepped out. Wright was a 15-year veteran who specialized in fraud cases, and Santos was glad to see him. If these men were running some kind of scam, Wright would figure it out quickly. "What do we have here, Santos?" Wright asked as he approached. "Possible impersonation of officials, detective. These two men claim to be HOA officers, but their credentials don't look legitimate to me. The complainant is a retired FBI agent who witnessed what she believed to be harassment of this elderly resident." Wright's interest was immediately piqued. "FBI? How long retired?" "6 months," Diana answered. 22 years in the Bureau." "What made you intervene?" Diana glanced at Mr. Chun, then back at Wright. "Detective, I've been working undercover for most of my career. You develop an eye for people who aren't what they claim to be. These gentlemen's behavior and equipment raised multiple red flags." Wright nodded and turned to Johnson and Foster. "Gentlemen, I'm going to need to see those credentials again, along with any official documentation that gives you authority to detain residents." As the fake officers reluctantly handed over their IDs, Wright noticed what Santos had seen, the poor quality of the credentials. But he also noticed something else that concerned him even more. "Mr. Johnson, I see you have zip ties and what appears to be a stun gun on your belt. Can you explain why HOA officials would need that equipment?" Johnson's face flushed red. Sometimes people get uncooperative. We need to be able to protect ourselves." "And the zip ties?" For restraining people who become violent." Wright and Santos exchanged glances. This was sounding less like legitimate HOA work and more like vigilante activity with every passing minute. Detective Wright pulled Santos aside for a quick conference. "Run their names through the system. I want to know if they have any priors. Also, contact the real HOA for Pinewood Estates and find out if they have any compliance officers." While Santos worked on her radio, Wright approached Diana. "Ms. Washington, I'd like to get your professional opinion on something. You said you've done undercover work." "Extensively. Organized crime mostly. Some domestic terrorism cases. In your professional judgment, what do you think we're dealing with here?" Diana considered the question carefully. "Detective, based on their equipment, their behavior, and their obvious lack of proper training, I'd guess they're either running a con of some kind or they're vigilantes who've decided to take neighborhood enforcement into their own hands. Either way, they're dangerous because they're operating without proper authority or oversight." Wright nodded. This aligned with his own assessment. "Have you seen them in the neighborhood before?" "First time I've noticed them, but I've only been working in this area for about a month. However, their van was positioned in a way that suggested surveillance rather than routine patrol." Officer Santos returned with information from her radio calls. "Detective, I've got some interesting news. First, neither Johnson nor Foster has any criminal history, but Johnson has a concealed carry permit that was revoked 6 months ago for making threats against a neighbor in his own subdivision. Second, the Pinewood Estates HOA says they don't have any compliance officers. All enforcement is done through the County Code Enforcement Office." Wright turned to face the fake officers with a serious expression. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. The HOA says they don't employ compliance officers. Would you like to explain what you're really doing here?" Foster started to speak, but Johnson cut him off with a sharp look. "We want to call our lawyer," Johnson said. "That's certainly your right," Wright replied. "But first, you're both under arrest for impersonating public officials, attempted unlawful detention, and assault. Mr. Foster, you're also being charged with attempted assault for trying to grab Ms. Washington." As Wright began reading them their Miranda rights, Diana noticed a small crowd of residents had gathered on the sidewalk to watch the proceedings. Most of them looked shocked that something like this could happen in their quiet, upscale neighborhood. One woman, Diana recognized her as Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, approached Officer Santos. "Excuse me, officer. I think I may have some information about these men." Santos looked up from her notes. "What kind of information, ma'am?" "I've seen their van in the neighborhood several times over the past few weeks. They always seem to be watching the houses where the minority residents live. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to assume anything." This revelation added another disturbing layer to the situation. Detective Wright made a note to follow up with Mrs. Patterson and any other residents who might have observed the fake officers' activities. As the fake officers were being placed in handcuffs, Johnson turned to Diana with an expression of pure hatred. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. This neighborhood doesn't need people like you stirring up trouble." Diana looked at him calmly. Sir, the only trouble I see here is two men who thought they could intimidate and harass people without consequences. You were wrong. Mr. Chun approached Diana as the fake officers were being loaded into police cars. Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. I was so frightened. I thought they might really hurt me. You don't need to thank me, Mr. Chun. I'm just glad you're okay. But what you did, the way you handled that man, that was incredible. Where did you learn to do that? Diana smiled gently. I spent a lot of years learning how to protect people. It's what I did before I started cleaning houses. Detective Wright overheard this exchange and approached them. Ms. Washington, I'd like to ask you a few more questions, if you don't mind. Your observations and actions here may be crucial to our investigation. Of course, Detective. Whatever I can do to help. First, you mentioned that you've been working in this neighborhood for about a month. Have you noticed any other suspicious activity? Diana thought carefully. Not exactly suspicious, but I have noticed that the security guards at the main gate seem to pay a lot more attention to certain visitors than others. There's definitely a pattern to who gets questioned more thoroughly. What kind of pattern? People of color get stopped and questioned even when they have proper identification and appointments. White visitors are usually waved through with minimal scrutiny. Detective Wright made another note. This suggested that the problems in Pinewood Estates might go deeper than just two fake officers. Officer Santos rejoined them after finishing her paperwork. Detective, we're getting some interesting calls on the radio. Apparently, word is spreading through the neighborhood about what happened here. Several residents are calling to report suspicious activities by men matching the description of our fake officers. What kind of activities? Following housekeepers and landscapers, questioning delivery drivers, taking photographs of certain houses. It sounds like these guys have been running their own little investigation unit. Diana wasn't surprised by this news. In her experience, people who appointed themselves as unofficial law enforcement rarely limited their activities to a single incident. They usually developed patterns of harassment that escalated over time. Mrs. Henderson appeared from across the street, looking concerned and confused. Diana? Officer, is everything all right? I heard sirens. Diana realized she'd been so focused on the situation that she'd completely forgotten about her work responsibilities. Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry. There was an incident in the neighborhood, and I had to get involved. I'll come back and finish the house right away. Don't you dare apologize, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. From what I can see, you helped someone who needed it. That's far more important than house cleaning. Detective Wright looked at Mrs. Henderson with interest. Ma'am, are you familiar with Ms. Washington's background? Her background? She's our housekeeper. She does excellent work. Did you know she's a retired FBI agent? Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened in shock. FBI? Diana, is that true? Diana nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed by all the attention. Yes, ma'am. I retired 6 months ago. My goodness. And you're working as a housekeeper? Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson. I'm taking care of my mother, and I needed work that would give me flexibility with her care schedule. Mrs. Henderson looked thoughtful. Diana, we need to talk. But first, Detective, is there anything else you need from her? Detective Wright shook his head. I have her contact information. Ms. Washington, thank you for your assistance today. Your professional training likely prevented this situation from becoming much worse. As the police cars departed with the fake officers, Diana found herself surrounded by curious neighbors who had witnessed the morning's events. Word was spreading quickly through Pinewood Estates that their quiet neighborhood housekeeper was actually a legendary FBI agent. Mr. Chun was still holding his small dog, but he looked much calmer now. Ms. Washington, I hope this doesn't cause problems for you with your work. Don't worry about me, Mr. Chun. I'm more concerned about making sure you feel safe in your own neighborhood. I've lived here for 8 years, and this is the first time anything like this has happened. But I have to admit, I've always felt like some people here wished I lived somewhere else. Diana nodded sympathetically. She'd seen enough discrimination in her career to recognize the subtle signs that Mr. Chun was probably referring to. Mrs. Patterson approached them hesitantly. Mr. Chun, I owe you an apology. I've seen those men watching your house several times, and I should have said something sooner. I should have called the police. It's all right, Mrs. Patterson. You couldn't have known they weren't legitimate. Still, I should have trusted my instincts. Something about them always seemed wrong. As the crowd of neighbors gradually dispersed, Diana realized that 3 days after the incident with the fake HOA officers, Diana found herself sitting in the elegant living room of the Henderson home, but this time as a guest rather than an employee. Mrs. Henderson had insisted on this meeting, and what she had to say would change everything about Diana's quiet retirement. "Diana," Mrs. Henderson began, setting down her coffee cup, "I've been doing some research since Tuesday morning. Did you know that what happened to Mr. Chen wasn't an isolated incident?" Diana raised an eyebrow. In her FBI career, isolated incidents were rare. Patterns were everywhere once you knew how to look for them. "What kind of research?" "I'm a real estate attorney, as you know. I have access to public records, legal databases, and a network of colleagues throughout the city. I started making some calls after I learned about your background." Mrs. Henderson pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase. "What I found is deeply disturbing." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. "In the past 18 months, there have been 11 complaints filed against Pinewood Estates for various forms of discrimination. Most were dismissed or settled quietly, but the pattern is clear." Diana leaned forward to examine the papers. Her FBI training kicked in automatically as she began scanning the documents for patterns and connections. "What types of discrimination?" "Harassment of minority residents, selective enforcement of rules, intimidation of housekeeping staff, lawn service workers, and delivery drivers." The complaints all describe similar tactics. Men in official-looking uniforms claiming to have authority they don't actually possess. "Johnson and Foster have been doing this for a while." "It gets worse," Mrs. Henderson continued. "I contacted several other upscale neighborhoods in the metro area. At least 4 other communities have reported similar problems with fake officials targeting minority residents and service workers. But here's the really concerning part. In 2 cases, the harassment escalated to the point where families actually moved away." Diana felt a familiar anger building in her chest. She'd spent her career fighting organized crime. But this kind of systematic harassment was just as damaging to communities and families. Have the police made connections between these incidents? That's where things get complicated. Each incident was handled by different jurisdictions, different police departments. No one was looking at the bigger picture until now. Mrs. Henderson reached for another set of documents. "I also found something else that I think will interest you. Johnson and Foster aren't working alone. They're part of something called Community Standards Enforcement. It's apparently a company that offers services to homeowners associations." "A company?" "On paper, yes. But when I tried to research them, I hit dead ends everywhere. No proper business license, no official address, no tax records I could find. Whatever they're doing, they're trying very hard to stay off the radar." Diana studied the fake business documents. Her years of investigating financial crimes had taught her to spot shell companies and fraudulent operations. "This looks like a front operation. They're using the appearance of legitimacy to gain access to neighborhoods and target specific groups." "That's exactly what I was thinking. Diana, I'll be blunt. I think we're looking at something that goes way beyond 2 men with fake badges. This appears to be organized, systematic, and potentially very dangerous." Diana sat back in her chair, processing the implications. She'd thought her law enforcement days were behind her, but the evidence spread across the table suggested she'd stumbled into something that required her unique skills and experience. "Mrs. Henderson, why are you sharing this with me? You could take this information to the police or the FBI directly. Because I think you're uniquely positioned to handle this situation. You have federal law enforcement experience, you understand the community from the inside now, and you've already proven that you're willing to act when people are in danger." Mrs. Henderson paused, choosing her words carefully. "Also, I suspect that this operation has been successful partly because no one expected to encounter someone with your background working as a housekeeper." Diana had to admit there was truth to that observation. Her undercover experience had taught her that people often revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson added. "I spoke with the board members of the real Pinewood Estates HOA yesterday. They're horrified by what's been happening in their name, and they want to take action. They're prepared to hire a private security consultant to investigate this situation thoroughly." Diana could see where this conversation was heading. "And you think they should hire me?" I think you're perfect for the job. You have the skills, the experience, and now you have the motivation. Plus, you've already started the investigation by being in the right place at the right time on Tuesday. Diana considered the proposal. The work would certainly be more interesting than house cleaning, and the pay would likely be better. More importantly, it would allow her to use her skills to protect people who were being targeted by what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal operation. What exactly would the job involve? Full investigation into community standards enforcement and any related operations. Document their activities, identify their members, determine the scope of their operations, and gather evidence for law enforcement prosecution. The HOA board is prepared to pay consultant rates, and they want this handled professionally and thoroughly. Diana thought about Mr. Chin sitting on the curb, about the fear in his eyes, about the systematic targeting of people who couldn't fight back. Then, she thought about her mother's medical bills and the financial pressure that had driven her to house cleaning in the first place. I'll need complete access to HOA records, full cooperation from board members, and the understanding that if this investigation uncovers criminal activity, I'll be turning everything over to federal authorities. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I was hoping you'd say yes. The board meeting is tonight at 7 o'clock. Can you attend? I'll be there. That afternoon, Diana spent several hours organizing her thoughts and reviewing the documents Mrs. Henderson had provided. The more she studied the pattern of incidents, the more convinced she became that community standards enforcement was a well-planned operation designed to drive certain residents out of upscale neighborhoods. The targeting was too specific to be random harassment. In every case, the victims were either minority families who had recently moved to predominantly white neighborhoods, or service workers who served those families. The fake officers always claimed to be enforcing community standards, but their interpretation of those standards seemed to apply only to certain groups of people. Diana also noticed that the incidents followed a clear escalation pattern. First came surveillance and intimidation, then verbal harassment and threats. Finally, physical confrontation and attempts at illegal detention. If the pattern continued, she was concerned that it would eventually escalate to actual violence. At 7 o'clock sharp, Diana arrived at the Pinewood Estates Community Center for the emergency HOA board meeting. She'd traded her cleaning uniform for a professional Navy suit that instantly transformed her appearance from service worker to authority figure. The difference in how people looked at her was immediate and telling. The board consisted of 5 members, all of whom looked deeply uncomfortable as they reviewed the evidence Mrs. Henderson had compiled. The board president, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was a retired federal judge who clearly understood the legal implications of what they were discussing. Ms. Washington, Dr. Mitchell began, Margaret Henderson has briefed us on your background and the events of Tuesday morning. We're embarrassed and angry that this has been happening in our community without our knowledge. Diana nodded. Dr. Mitchell, how long has the board been aware of complaints about fake officials in the neighborhood? That's the troubling part. We weren't aware of any pattern. Individual complaints were handled by our property management company, and, apparently, they were either dismissed as misunderstandings or handled so quietly that the board never heard about them. Who is your property management company? Prestige Property Management. They've been handling day-to-day operations for Pinewood Estates for about 2 years. Diana made a note. In her experience, property management companies that failed to report serious incidents to their clients were often part of the problem rather than just negligent. Board member Tom Rodriguez spoke up. Ms. Washington, we understand you're willing to investigate this situation for us. What would your approach be? First, I want to interview every resident who's experienced harassment or suspicious activity. I need to understand the full scope of what's been happening. Second, I'd investigate community standards enforcement thoroughly, who's behind it, how they operate, and whether they're targeting other communities. Third, I'd work with law enforcement to ensure that any criminal activity is properly prosecuted. How long do you think an investigation would take? Asked board member Lisa Park. That depends on what we find. If this is just Johnson and Foster acting on their own, probably a few weeks. But if they're part of a larger operation, as the evidence suggests, it could take several months to uncover the full extent of their activities. Dr. Mitchell looked around the table at her fellow board members. I think we're all in agreement that this investigation needs to happen. Ms. Washington, the board is prepared to hire you as a private security consultant at a rate of $1,500 per day, plus expenses. Does that work for you? Diana was surprised by the generous offer. At that rate, she could afford her mother's care and still have money left over for savings. That's very generous. Yes, that works for me. Excellent. When can you start? I've already started, Diana replied. But if you want to make it official, I can have a contract ready for signature tomorrow morning. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Mitchell approached Diana privately. Ms. Washington, I want you to know that you have the board's complete support for this investigation. We're also prepared to involve federal authorities if necessary. This community should be safe for everyone who lives here. Diana appreciated the board's commitment, but she also knew that investigations like this could uncover uncomfortable truths about communities that preferred to see themselves as progressive and inclusive. Dr. Mitchell, I should warn you that investigations like this sometimes reveal problems that go beyond the obvious perpetrators. Are you prepared for the possibility that some residents or community leaders might have been complicit in this harassment? Dr. Mitchell's expression was serious. Ms. Washington, I spent 30 years on the federal bench. I've seen how discrimination works, and I know it rarely happens without some level of community tolerance or support. We want the truth, whatever it is. Diana left the meeting feeling energized in a way she hadn't experienced since leaving the FBI. She was back to doing what she did best, investigating complex criminal operations and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. But as she drove home, she also felt a familiar sense of anticipation and caution. In her experience, people who ran operations like community standards enforcement didn't give up easily when their activities were exposed. They typically escalated their tactics or tried to intimidate anyone who threatened their operation. Diana had faced down organized crime bosses, international drug dealers, and domestic terrorists in her FBI career. A couple of fake HOA officers and their backers didn't scare her. But she also knew better than to underestimate any criminal operation, no matter how small it might appear at first glance. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Washington. The voice was male, older, and carried an unmistakable tone of menace. Yes, this is a friendly warning. You made a mistake on Tuesday morning. Walking away from certain situations is better for everyone's health. Do you understand what I'm saying? Diana felt a familiar calm settle over her. The same feeling she'd experienced countless times when criminals tried to intimidate her. Actually, I don't think I do understand. Could you be more specific? Smart people mind their own business. You seem like a smart woman. I'm sure you can figure out what's best for everyone involved. And I'm sure you can figure out that threatening a federal agent, even a retired one, is a serious crime. Have a good evening. Diana hung up and immediately called Detective Wright to report the threat. Then, she sat in her car for a moment, thinking about what the call meant. Someone was scared enough of her investigation to make threats 2 weeks into her investigation. Diana had uncovered a criminal network far more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Working from a makeshift office in her home, she'd transformed her dining room into a command center that would have impressed her former FBI colleagues. Maps, photographs, financial records, and connection charts covered every available surface. The threatening phone call had been just the beginning. Since taking on the investigation, Diana had received anonymous letters, had her car vandalized, and noticed suspicious vehicles parked near her house. Rather than intimidating her, these tactics had simply confirmed that she was closing in on something big. Detective Wright had become her primary law enforcement contact, and he'd been invaluable in helping her navigate the jurisdictional complexities of an investigation that now spanned 3 counties and involved at least 7 different police departments. This morning, he was sitting at her kitchen table reviewing the evidence she'd compiled. Diana, this is extraordinary work, Wright said, studying a financial flowchart that traced money through half a dozen shell companies. How did you connect prestige property management to community standards enforcement? Old-fashioned detective work, Diana replied, pouring coffee. I started by interviewing residents who'd been harassed. 3 different people mentioned that the fake officers always seemed to know personal details about them. Work schedules, family members, recent purchases. That suggested inside information. And Prestige had access to that information. Exactly. Property management companies maintain detailed records on residents. When I dug deeper into Prestige's ownership structure, I found connections to community standards enforcement through a web of shared addresses, phone numbers, and bank accounts. Wright flipped through the financial records Diana had obtained through her network of contacts in the banking industry. According to this, they've been operating for almost 3 years and have contracts with property management companies serving over 40 upscale communities across the Southeast. It gets worse, Diana said, pulling out another folder. I've identified at least 15 families who moved away from these communities after being harassed. In every case, their homes were purchased by the same real estate investment company within 6 months. That's not a coincidence. Not even close. They're not just harassing people for fun. They're systematically driving down property values in specific areas, then buying up homes at below-market prices. Wright whistled softly. That's a federal crime. Mail fraud, wire fraud, civil rights violations, conspiracy, the list goes on. Which is why I called my former colleagues at the Bureau yesterday. They're opening an official investigation. Diana's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed a number she recognized from her recent investigative work. Ms. Washington, this is Carol Martinez. I'm a reporter with the Atlanta Constitution. I understand you've been investigating fake officials targeting minority residents in several upscale neighborhoods. Diana glanced at Wright, who nodded. Media attention could be helpful at this stage of the investigation. Ms. Martinez, I can confirm that I'm working as a private consultant investigating harassment in some local communities. What's your interest in this story? We've received information suggesting that this goes far beyond a few bad actors. We're hearing about a systematic operation affecting dozens of families across multiple communities. Would you be willing to speak with us on the record? I might be, but I need to coordinate with law enforcement. There's an active criminal investigation underway. I understand. Would it be possible to meet and discuss what information might be appropriate to share publicly? Diana looked at Wright again, who was already reaching for his phone. Let me check with the investigating officers and get back to you. After hanging up, Wright immediately called his supervisor. Captain, we need to talk about media strategy for the Pinewood Estates case. It's gotten a lot bigger than we initially thought. While Wright coordinated with his department, Diana reviewed her latest findings. The most disturbing discovery had come just yesterday when she'd finally managed to interview the Hendersons' former housekeeper, Maria Santos, not to be confused with Officer Santos. Maria had been working in Pinewood Estates for 3 years before quitting suddenly, 6 months ago. When Diana tracked her down, she learned that Maria had been approached by men claiming to be ICE agents who demanded to see her documentation. Even though Maria was a U.S. citizen with proper work authorization, the experience had frightened her so badly that she'd stopped working in upscale neighborhoods entirely. They knew details about my family, my schedule, which houses I worked at, Maria had told Diana. They said if I didn't stop working in certain neighborhoods, they would make sure ICE investigated my immigration status. Even though I had nothing to hide, I couldn't afford the legal problems or the stress. Diana had documented at least 12 similar cases of service workers being targeted with fake immigration enforcement. The pattern was clear. Community standards enforcement was using multiple fake official identities to intimidate different groups of people. Wright finished his phone call and returned to the table. Good news and bad news. The good news is that the FBI task force wants to coordinate with your investigation. The bad news is that we're getting pressure to keep the media involvement minimal until we have arrests. I understand the concern, but media attention might encourage more victims to come forward. A lot of people who've been harassed probably assumed it was just bad luck or isolated incidents. That's exactly what Captain Morrison said. We're going to arrange a careful media briefing that protects the investigation while encouraging witnesses to contact us. Diana's doorbell rang, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Through the window, she could see 2 men in business suits standing on her porch. Neither of them looked like they were there for a social visit. Expecting company? Wright asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. No. And after 2 weeks of threats and harassment, I'm not taking chances with unexpected visitors. Diana activated her home security system's intercom. Gentlemen, can I help you? Ms. Washington, This is Detective Robert Kane from the Gwinnett County Sheriff's Office. We need to speak with you about an ongoing investigation. Diana looked at Wright, who was already pulling out his phone to verify the visitor's identity. Something about their demeanor and the fact that they'd shown up unannounced made her suspicious. I'd be happy to speak with you, Detective Kane. Could you please hold up your credentials to the door camera so I can verify your identity? The two men exchanged glances, and Diana immediately knew they weren't legitimate law enforcement. Real cops expected to have their credentials checked and were prepared for it. Ma'am, just open the door. We don't have time for games. Wright had finished his call and shook his head at Diana. Gwinnett County has no Detective Robert Kane, and they haven't sent anyone to speak with you. Diana activated her home's panic alarm, which would immediately alert local police and private security. The loud siren apparently surprised the fake detectives, who quickly retreated to a black sedan parked across the street. This is escalating faster than I expected, Diana told Wright as they watched the car speed away. They're getting desperate enough to try direct intimidation at my home. Wright was already on his radio calling for patrol cars to respond to Diana's address and attempt to locate the black sedan. Diana, I think you need to consider relocating temporarily while we wrap up this investigation. I'm not running from these people. Besides, coming after me directly tells us they're scared of what I'm finding. It also tells us they're willing to escalate to direct threats. These aren't just con artists anymore. They're showing signs of organized criminal behavior. Diana had to admit that Wright had a point. The fake officials had gone from harassment and intimidation to attempting to breach her home security. That suggested either desperation or confidence that they could operate without consequences. Her phone rang again. This time it was FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, her former partner, and one of the Bureau's top experts on organized crime. Diana, I just finished reviewing the case file you sent us. This is impressive work, but I'm concerned about your safety. We're hearing chatter that suggests this organization has connections to some very serious people. What kind of connections? The real estate investment company that's been buying up the properties? It appears to be connected to a money laundering operation we've been investigating for 2 years. If they're willing to intimidate and harass families to acquire properties, they might be willing to go much further to protect their operation. Diana felt a chill run down her spine. Money laundering operations often involved organized crime families or drug cartels, groups that didn't hesitate to use violence when their business interests were threatened. Rebecca, how quickly can the Bureau move on this? We're assembling a task force now. But, Diana, I need you to step back and let us handle it from here. These people have already shown they're willing to target you directly. I understand the concern, but they've made this personal. Besides, I have information and contacts they'll need weeks to develop. Then, work with us officially. I can arrange for you to be appointed as a temporary consultant to the task force. That would give you federal protection and resources while keeping you involved in the investigation. Diana looked at Wright, who was nodding enthusiastically. That sounds like a good compromise. When do we start? Tomorrow morning. But, tonight, you're staying in a safe house. No arguments. An hour later, Diana found herself in a nondescript hotel room under FBI protection while agents processed her home for evidence and secured her research materials. It felt strange to be on the protected side of an investigation after so many years of being the one doing the protecting. Agent Torres arrived at the safe house that evening with a briefcase full of additional evidence that the FBI had been developing independently. Diana, we've been tracking this organization for longer than you know. What started as a civil rights investigation has evolved into something much larger. Torres spread out surveillance photographs, financial records, and wiretap transcripts. Community standards enforcement is actually the street-level operation for a network that we believe is responsible for systemic property manipulation in upscale communities across at least 5 states. Property manipulation? They identify communities with growing minority populations or strong property values, then use harassment and intimidation to drive out specific residents. Once property values drop, their partner real estate companies buy properties at reduced prices. Then, they clean up the community standards and resell at huge profits. Diana studied the scope of the operation mapped out in the FBI files. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate? about $50 million in illegal profits over the past 3 years. But the social damage is incalculable: families displaced, communities destabilized, and civil rights systematically violated. Who's at the top of this organization? Torres pulled out a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Meet Marcus Whitfield. On paper, he's a successful real estate developer and property management executive. In reality, he's the architect of one of the most sophisticated housing discrimination schemes the Bureau has encountered. Diana studied Whitfield's photograph. He looked exactly like the kind of respectable businessman who could operate criminal enterprises while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. Where does Johnson and Foster fit into this? Street-level enforcement. They're essentially thugs with fake badges who do the dirty work, while Whitfield maintains plausible deniability. Diana thought about Mr. Chin sitting on the curb, about Maria Santos being too frightened to work, about all the families who had been driven from their homes. Rebecca, when do we take them down? Soon. But we need to coordinate arrests across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. If we move too early, the key players will disappear, and if we move too late, they might escalate to actual violence. 6 months later, Diana stood in the federal courthouse in Atlanta watching as Marcus Whitfield was led away in handcuffs after receiving a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The judge had been particularly harsh in her sentencing, noting that Whitfield's operation had violated the civil rights of over 200 families while generating millions in illegal profits. The coordinated takedown had been spectacular. On a single morning in March, FBI agents and local law enforcement had executed 47 search warrants across 5 states, arresting 31 people connected to the Community Standards Enforcement Network. The evidence recovered included detailed records of targeted families, financial documents showing the money laundering operation, and communications that clearly demonstrated the systematic nature of the discrimination. Johnson and Foster had been among the first to flip, providing testimony that connected Whitfield to specific acts of harassment and intimidation. Their cooperation had been crucial in demonstrating that the fake official scheme was directed from the top rather than the independent actions of rogue employees. Ms. Washington, Diana turned to see Robert Chin approaching with his wife and teenage daughter. He looked completely different from the frightened man who had been sitting on the curb 6 months earlier, confident, relaxed, and smiling. Mr. Chun, how wonderful to see you. How are you doing? We're doing very well, thanks to you. I wanted you to meet my family. This is my wife Linda and my daughter Amy. Diana shook hands with both women. Mr. Chun has told me so much about both of you. I'm glad we finally get to meet. Amy Chun, who was about 17, looked at Diana with obvious admiration. Ms. Washington, my dad told me about what you did. That was so amazing. I want to be an FBI agent when I graduate from college. That's wonderful, Amy. It's challenging work, but very rewarding when you can help people the way your father helped us understand what was really happening in the community. Linda Chun smiled warmly. Ms. Washington, we can never thank you enough. When Robert told us what happened that morning, we were so frightened. We started talking about moving away. But you helped us realize that we belonged in our neighborhood as much as anyone else. You absolutely belong there, Diana replied firmly. No one should have to leave their home because of harassment and intimidation. Mr. Chin's expression grew serious. Diana, I hope you know that what you did went far beyond helping just one family. The FBI told us that dozens of families were being targeted, and many had already been driven away. Your actions saved our community. Diana felt a familiar warmth, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times during her FBI career when cases concluded successfully. But this case felt different because it had started with a single moment of seeing someone in trouble and choosing to act. Agent Torres approached their group, carrying a thick folder. Diana, we just got the final restitution numbers from the court. Whitfield's organization will be paying over $12 million to families who were harassed or forced to relocate. The real estate companies will also be required to offer first rights of refusal to any former residents who want to buy back their properties at fair market value. What about the property management companies? Prestige Property Management and 4 related companies have been shut down permanently. The court has appointed independent management for all affected communities while new companies are selected through a transparent bidding process. Diana nodded with satisfaction. Financial restitution could never fully compensate families for what they'd endured, but it was an important step toward justice. Mrs. Henderson joined their group, looking elegant as always but with an expression of deep satisfaction. Diana, I just wanted to thank you one more time before the reception. The Pinewood Estates Board voted unanimously to name you an honorary lifetime resident. We'll also be establishing a community watch program based on the recommendations in your final report. Mrs. Henderson, that's very generous, but unnecessary. It's completely necessary, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. What happened in our community was unacceptable, and the fact that it went on for so long without proper response was a failure of leadership. Your investigation didn't just solve a crime. It taught us how to be better neighbors. Dr. Mitchell, the HOA board president and retired federal judge, approached their group with a young woman Diana didn't recognize. Diana, I'd like you to meet Jessica Williams. She's a reporter with the Washington Post who's been following your story. Diana shook hands with Williams, noting the recorder in her other hand. Ms. Williams, are you working on an article about the case? Actually, I'm working on a much larger piece about housing discrimination and how criminal organizations exploit regulatory gaps to target vulnerable communities. Your investigation has become a model that other communities are using to identify and address similar problems. Really, the FBI tells me that your techniques have been adopted for investigations in 12 other metropolitan areas. There's also legislation being introduced in Congress that would create federal oversight for property management companies serving federally insured communities. Agent Torres nodded. Diana, you should know that this case has had national impact. The Justice Department is using your investigation as a template for a new civil rights enforcement initiative. Diana felt overwhelmed by the scope of what had grown from a simple decision to help a neighbor in trouble. I was just doing what anyone should do when they see someone being harassed. That's exactly why this story is important, Williams said. Most people don't act when they see injustice, even when they have the ability to help. Your actions show what's possible when someone with the right skills chooses to get involved. Mr. Chin spoke up quietly. Ms. Washington, you said anyone should do what you did. But you weren't just anyone. You were exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Diana looked around at the group of people whose lives had been affected by the investigation. She thought about the families who had been able to stay in their homes, the service workers who no longer feared harassment, and the communities that were now taking active steps to prevent discrimination. Actually, I think we were all the right people, Diana said. Mr. Chun, you stood up to intimidation even when you were frightened. Mrs. Henderson, you chose to research and act instead of just expressing concern. Dr. Mitchell, you supported a thorough investigation even when it might have reflected poorly on your community. Everyone here played a crucial role. Detective Wright approached their group, looking slightly out of place in a suit rather than his usual uniform. Diana, I just wanted to update you on the final case dispositions. Johnson and Foster received 8 years each in federal prison. All but 3 of the other defendants pled guilty and received sentences ranging from 2 to 12 years. What about the 3 who didn't plead? Trial is scheduled for September. The prosecutor is confident we have strong cases against all of them. Wright paused, then continued with a slight smile. Diana, I also wanted to let you know that the department has created a new position, Community Liaison Investigator. It's specifically designed for someone with federal law enforcement experience who can work with communities to identify and investigate complex criminal schemes. Diana raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting coincidence. Not really a coincidence. We wrote the position description with you in mind. Interested, Diana considered the offer. The work would be challenging and meaningful, allowing her to use her skills to protect communities while providing the financial stability she needed for her mother's care. Can I work flexible hours? I still need to be available for my mother's medical appointments. Absolutely. The position is designed around casework rather than regular shifts. Agent Torres smiled. Diana, I should mention that the FBI has also created a consultant position for retired agents who want to work on community-based civil rights cases. We'd love to have you available for cases that need your particular expertise. Diana looked around at all the people whose lives had intersected because of that morning 6 months ago when she'd seen Robert Chin being harassed by fake officials. The ripple effects had spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. "I appreciate both offers," Diana said finally. "Let me think about it and get back to you." As the group began to disperse for the post-trial reception, Amy Chin approached Diana privately. "Ms. Washington, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Amy." "When you saw those men bothering my dad, were you scared?" Diana considered the question seriously. "I was concerned about the situation, but I wasn't scared of the men themselves. My training taught me how to assess threats and respond appropriately. But what if you hadn't been a former FBI agent? What if you really were just a housekeeper like they thought?" "That's an excellent question, Amy. I think the most important thing isn't what training someone has, but whether they're willing to act when they see something wrong happening to another person." Amy nodded thoughtfully. "So anyone could have helped my dad that day? Anyone could have called the police, documented what was happening, or simply stood as a witness so your father wasn't facing the situation alone. The specific techniques I used came from my training, but the choice to get involved, that's something anyone can make." "That's what I thought you'd say," Amy said with a smile. "That's why I want to be an FBI agent. Not for the exciting investigations, but because I want to be someone who has the training to help when help is needed." Diana smiled back, remembering her own decision to join the FBI decades earlier. "Amy, I think you're going to make an excellent agent." As Diana walked toward the courthouse exit, she reflected on the unexpected direction her retirement had taken. She'd planned to spend her time quietly caring for her mother and maybe doing some part-time consulting work. Instead, she'd uncovered a major criminal conspiracy, helped dozens of families, and apparently inspired a new generation of law enforcement officers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the nursing home where her mother lived. "Your mother is asking for you. She's having one of her good days and wants to hear about your work." Diana smiled. Her mother's Alzheimer's made good days precious and unpredictable, but when they came, she was still the sharp, caring woman who had raised Diana to stand up for what was right. As she drove toward the nursing home, Diana thought about the job offers she'd received. Both positions would allow her to continue using her skills to help communities while maintaining the flexibility she needed for her mother's care. But more than that, they would allow her to build on what she'd learned from the Pinewood Estates case. There were undoubtedly other communities facing similar problems, other families being targeted by criminal organizations that hid behind legitimate business facades. Diana Washington had thought her law enforcement career was over when she retired from the FBI. Instead, it seemed she was just getting started on the most important work of her professional life, teaching communities how to recognize, investigate, and fight back against systematic discrimination and criminal harassment. The fake HOA officers had made the mistake of assuming that a woman in a cleaning uniform couldn't be a threat to their operation. That assumption had cost them their freedom and destroyed a criminal network that had terrorized families across multiple states. But, more importantly, their mistake had led to something positive, a new model for community-based law enforcement that put protecting people ahead of protecting appearances. Diana pulled into the nursing home parking lot, looking forward to sharing her good news with the woman who had taught her that helping others was always worth the risk. Some retirements, she reflected, turn out to be new beginnings in disguise. Diana looked out the hotel window at the city lights of Atlanta. Somewhere out there, Marcus Whitfield was probably sleeping comfortably in his mansion, thinking he'd built the perfect crime, one that hid behind legitimate business practices and community standards. He was about to learn that sometimes the people you least suspect are the ones most capable of bringing down your entire operation. Tomorrow, Diana Washington would go back to work. But this time, she'd have the full resources of the FBI behind her. And Marcus Whitfield's criminal empire was about to face the kind of investigation that had made her legendary in federal law enforcement. The fake HOA officers had made the mistake of targeting someone who looked like an easy victim. That mistake was going to cost them everything, which meant she was on the right track. It also meant that community standards enforcement had connections that allowed them to get her personal phone number within 3 days of Johnson and Foster's arrest. This was definitely not just two men with fake badges. This was an organized operation with resources and reach that extended beyond Pinewood Estates. Diana smiled grimly as she walked toward her house. She'd been looking forward to a quiet retirement, but it looked like the criminals had other plans for her. That was their mistake. The morning's events had changed something fundamental about her position in the community. She was no longer just the invisible housekeeper who cleaned homes and stayed out of sight. Her true background was now known, and that was going to have consequences she couldn't yet predict. Mrs. Henderson approached her as she prepared to go back to work. Diana, I meant what I said earlier. We need to talk. What happened here today tells me that this neighborhood might need someone with your skills more than it needs another housekeeper. Diana looked back at the spot where Mr. Chun had been forced to sit on the curb by men with no real authority, and she realized that Mrs. Henderson might be right. Her retirement from the FBI had been supposed to be the end of her law enforcement career, but maybe it was actually the beginning of something new. The quiet, perfectly manicured streets of Pinewood Estates suddenly looked different to her trained eye. She was beginning to see the community not as an idyllic suburban paradise, but as a place where serious problems had been hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. And Diana Washington had never been able to walk away from a problem that needed solving. Calm. In her peripheral vision, she could see a police car turning onto the street. And I suggest you very carefully reconsider whatever you're thinking about doing with that device. Mr. Chun was staring at Diana with amazement. Ma'am, how did you, 22 years of federal law enforcement training, Diana replied simply, never taking her eyes off the first fake officer. And these gentlemen are about to learn that appearances can be very deceiving. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and Diana could see the relief on Mr. Chen's face. But she could also see that the fake officers were beginning to panic, which made them even more dangerous. You have no idea what you've just done, the first fake officer said, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. We know people, important people. This isn't over. You're absolutely right, Diana replied. This is just getting started.